In today's video, we're going to be ranking the books of E.M. Forster. Forster is one of my favourite writers. I read all of his books over several years, and recently I decided to read them again, going in chronological order, so that I could see how my feelings have changed, but also because I wanted to talk about them on the channel, and a ranking is a nice way to do that. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. In last place, we have Forster's first novel, Where Angels Fear to Tread. The story focuses on a family drama surrounding a decision made by the recently widowed Lila Harrington when she goes to Italy on holiday with her companion, Caroline Abbott. Furious at her decision, especially when it leads to a pregnancy, her dead husband's family get involved and try and pull her out of the situation, sending her brother-in-law, Philip, to deal with the situation. Unfortunately, it is too late. Lila marries Gino and dies shortly after in childbirth, leaving a big glaring question as to what the family is supposed to do with this child. One story did have to go last, and I'm afraid it is Forster's debut, and that's not because it is a bad novel. It is not a bad novel by any stretch of the imagination, it's just that everything else is arguably just a lot better. It has quite a few shocking twists and turns in it, and I wasn't expecting any of them, which is pretty impressive. It's also probably Forster's most tragic novel. It's the one that brought me closest to tears in any case when I was reading it, and he already lays down a lot of the archetypes that he will have in novels going forward. We have the focus on a woman or man caught between the need to pursue love and this coming into conflict with society's expectations. We have the scheming, eccentric matriarch, this being Philip's mother in this case, and she's a pretty rotten version of this archetype. Some of Forster's matriarchs that are quite eccentric are more funny, but the matriarch in this one is much more vicious than the ones we get in later novels. And of course we get Forster's trademark magical, atmospheric scenes, things that I've talked about with his writing before. The best one in this novel is a scene in which some of the characters go off to an opera, and they are just so swept away by this opera, the nights, the atmosphere, everything, and Forster captures that so well. In many ways, there aren't really negatives to this story. I do really enjoy it and would definitely read it again. It's also very short, which is a plus. I would say though that maybe some of the characterization is a bit flat, especially Gino. A lot of the plot centers around this man and people's judgments of him, and we don't really get all that much to him. He gets some character development for sure, but I just wish we spent a little bit more time with him as a character. That being said, I do recognise that part of the aim of this story is to understand the way that the British, with their societal norms, judge him both as a foreigner and as someone who is, marrying their daughter-in-law. And I guess if you gave too much development for Gino too early on, it would undermine what Forster is trying to do. So I do respect that to some extent. That being said, I do think a lot of the things that Forster lays out here are also just better explored in later novels as well. Still, it's not a bad entry point either. I think if you read this book, you would still want to read more after, so it's definitely worth checking out. Next we have, possibly a controversial choice, A Room with a View. Miss Lucy Honeychurch travels to, you guessed it, Italy with her travelling companion, the fussy and somewhat kind-hearted Miss Charlotte Bartlett. While there, they meet several unconventional characters. Firstly, Mr. Emerson and his young son George, and the delightfully ridiculous Miss Lavish, a professional novelist who writes some pretty trashy novels but isn't aware of that herself. Partly due to an ill-advised dalliance with George, Lucy and Charlotte quickly leave Italy for Rome, and there she comes across a man that she knew before called Cecil Vyse. Cecil proposes to Lucy a few times, and eventually she accepts his proposal, but then George comes back into her life, and once again we find a woman caught between society's expectations of what she should do and following her own heart, while also wanting to pursue her own freedom and independence, and finding that love, even when it's chosen freely, sometimes does get in the way in the pursuit of freedom. So as I said, this might be controversial, as A Room with a View is probably one of the big Forster books. It's probably one that you've heard of if you've heard of Forster at all. That being said, it's one that, while I can respect what Forster is doing, while I can appreciate some of the characters, some of the scenes, it does just leave me cold in comparison to the novels to come. I think the main issue for this, and it's something that comes up a little bit often with Forster, is that I don't buy the romance. And while that's fine in some of his novels when romance isn't the main thing, in A Room with a View, George and Lucy's relationship really is a centre to the story. And so if you don't buy that relationship, it's hard to really buy or understand the decisions that Lucy makes. On the positives though, we do get some of Forster's trademark humour in this one. Miss Lavish is one of my favourite characters in Forster. There's not much to her, but she's just so ridiculous. This woman who is full of herself, gallivanting around, thinking that she's highly cultured, when actually she's a gossip, running around stealing people's stories and putting them in badly written novels of her own. We also have the character of Freddie, Lucy's brother, and this is another type of character that comes up in Forster a couple of times. The sort of semi-useless but sort of sweet and endearing younger brother of the female leads in the novels. And I think Freddie is the best one because he is just delightful as a character. There's also, he just spends a lot of time being slightly ridiculous, and a lot of his scenes are just really enjoyable. There's also a rather erotic scene in this book when you have Freddie and some other men going down to a pond to bathe, and you can definitely tell that Forster is perhaps indulging his inclinations a little bit there. But it's a great scene nonetheless. Overall, A Room with a View has some wonderful characterization. It does have a good story. I'm just not sold on the central romance, and for that reason it knocks it back compared to the other novels on this list. Next up we have probably Forster's least known novel and one of his strangest, but his personal favourite, and that is The Longest Journey. The Longest Journey follows the story of Ricky Elliott, and we begin his story as he is a Cambridge student who is quite idealistic at this point. As a child he was quite unpopular and unhealthy. He still is a bit unhealthy, and he was bullied when he was younger, but at Cambridge he finds his set of intellectuals that embrace him, and they're all quite cynical, especially a young man called Stuart Ansell, who is an aspiring philosopher. Ricky also aspires to be a novelist one day, but his artistic ambitions and his idealism come into contact with reality when he meets up with Agnes and Gerald, two people who he knew from his younger days. After Gerald dies in a sporting accident, Agnes and Ricky strike a relationship that really is mostly born out of desperation and sympathy. Needless to say, this doesn't go well, and Ricky soon finds himself having to undermine his own artistic values and ambitions. Agnes forces him to get a job at her brother's school, and we also have the figure of Ricky's eccentric aunt, who has some dark family secrets that Ricky soon learns about. And once again, we have someone coming into contact with social expectations and trying to hold to their ideals. This one really is the hardest to place, because it kind of is the ugly duckling of Forster's works. Not to say it's bad, it's just it really stands out in a lot of ways. The story itself is quite different. You have this focus on a young man growing up, as opposed to a lot of the more love stories, or A Passage to India, which is a bit more political. And also the way that it's written. Most of Forster's novels are written in a conventional style, but The Longest Journey almost feels like a postmodern novel at times. There's a little bit of Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse coming through, although it doesn't have the finesse of, say, Virginia Woolf as a writer to sort of pull it off. And so the novel kind of doesn't succeed quite right at this, but it does create a very unique and strange atmosphere. You can certainly see why Forster probably took this to be his favourite novel, as it does seem to be quite a personal one. We have this writer with his artistic ambitions and these things getting frustrated. We also have a character who's quite sickly and unwell and feels isolated from society, things that I think Forster himself identified with, and so you can see the author a lot more in this text than you can in the other ones. Even Morris, which, although it is about homosexuality, is definitely externalized compared to this one. Ricky Elliott is probably one of my favourite Forster characters, but he is a very tragic character. He has a pretty sad story even before the novel begins, and things don't really get better in the course of the novel either. Watching someone slowly lose their ideals is always a tragic thing, but what's surprising about this novel is, even though it was written, I think, over 100 years ago now, a lot of it is still very relatable. There are some passages early in the novel when they're talking about the value of university, what they're going to do after university, and you could really just take those conversations, import them to the present day, make a few linguistic tweaks, and basically they would just be conversations that people would be having now. Like, what do you do with a humanities degree? You probably go to the civil service. What's the value of being an intellectual at all? What's the value of philosophy? So all of these things are pretty universal themes, or at the very least they still hold true to this day, and that's one thing that really struck a chord with me as I was reading this book. We also have the character of Aunt Emily, the eccentric matriarch of the novel, and she might even be worse than the character from Where Angels Fear to Tread. She keeps a not so nice secret from Ricky, she manipulates him, she's quite abusive, and she's able to pass it off with her charms, if you like. And Forster is just really good at understanding that kind of woman, that kind of charming woman that seems very inoffensive, just a little bit eccentric, but really she's quite vicious and sharp, and not in a Olenna Tyrell, you want to have her around kind of way, but in a seriously manipulative and abusive kind of way. I think this is definitely not a novel to sleep on by any means. Definitely, if you've not read it, if you've overlooked it, have a read, because it will introduce you to a whole new side of Forster's work. I would say it will be a difficult novel, and I wouldn't recommend this as a starting novel. I think any other novel you could begin with and it would be fine. But this one I wouldn't recommend because it might be off-putting due to the style, and also the style isn't really representative of Forster as a whole. For me though, the thing that does let the book down a little bit is the style compared to the other books. I did find it confusing. I don't think Forster works in the postmodern style as well as the postmodernists themselves do, and so for that reason, that's the thing that's really holding this book back. But otherwise, it's a fantastic read. Now we're on to the top 3, and coming in at 3rd place, we have Morris. Morris begins when the titular protagonist is just 14 years old, and he is taken away by his teacher, Mr. Ducey, to learn the lessons of love. In particular, he learns that marrying a woman, or securing the love of a woman, is the ultimate goal of life. But Morris doesn't relate to this, although he can't put his finger on why. Fast forward a few years and he realises why he couldn't relate to that message. At Cambridge University, he comes across a handsome young man called Clive Durham who is studying classics, especially focusing on the Greeks. And Morris falls head over heels in love with Clive, and Clive reciprocates. However, the relationship is pretty rocky, and ultimately Clive will reject his homosexuality along with Morris. But it's not all doom and gloom for Morris. He finds someone else, a working class man called Alex Scudder, who works on Clive's estate. And Morris must decide whether he will pursue this romance or whether he will let society's expectations force him into a life of conformity and repression. So Forster didn't publish this book in his lifetime as he was afraid that he might get a backlash. Not unreasonable. Even books that were about heterosexuality, if they touched on the subject of sex, they could get censored back in the day. Think of things like Lady Chatterley's Lover. And so of course he would think the same would be true of a homosexual novel, especially one that gives a happy ending to its characters. If I'd have done this list before rereading the books, Morris may have actually come 2nd or even 1st place, but one of the books really grabbed my attention in a way on this read-through, so that one has become much higher. And there are some flaws that I saw in Morris as well this time around. That being said, if I was to do a list of books focusing on homosexual romances, this might actually be my favourite that I have read, because it does some things that are just unconventional even by today's standards. Of course, Forster avoids easy tropes and stereotypes, such as the tragic stereotypes where one of the gays always dies, which still happens a lot even today, but he also avoids the typical sort of homophobic father stereotype. In this novel, it's Morris's mother and sisters who have a more insidious relationship with him due to his sexuality. They don't put their finger on it exactly, but there is definitely an undercurrent of homophobia going on, and I think it's quite clever for Forster to focus on that, as it's something that's focused on less in this kind of literature. But for me, the main thing is the fact that in giving his heroes a happy ending, he puts them in the woods. He sends them to nature as opposed to the city. In so much gay literature, the city is seen as some kind of beacon of hope for gays, and as someone who has always preferred the country, I've never really related to that idea, but I can understand why, because in today's society, especially in England, there really isn't nature anymore. You have the countryside, which consists of villages and towns, but everything is very cultured and contained, and so there's this sort of, pressure of society still infecting all of that. And in the city, although there is obviously society there as well, it's a little bit better because you can be anonymous and alone, which is why I don't really like cities. I find them depressing. Nevertheless, when Forster was writing, he describes a time when you could still get lost in what he calls the greenwood. And he's referring here to a time when England, of course, was a lot more wild. It was full of forests. And so there was a time when you could really get lost in nature. And Morris, he sees as being a novel that stands at the moment just before the First World War in terms of when it's set, when you could still do that, before industrialisation just took over everything, including the countryside, before we lost the ability to lose ourselves. And what Forster does by sending his gaze to nature is he makes a wonderful point, which is firstly that nature is freedom, not the city, which I agree with, and secondly, by putting them towards nature, he's suggesting that actually this is just a part of nature. It's not some kind of social construct. It's not some kind of disorder or whatever you want to go with. So it's a really clever metaphor, and one that I think is definitely worth appreciating, and that's why I really like this book, the message of the book. That being said, I do think there are some flaws to this novel. Firstly, and most importantly, like with A Room with a View, I don't buy the romance. Well, I buy the Clive and Maurice romance, but I don't buy the romance between Alec and Maurice. And the reason for that mainly is just because the romance goes too quickly. I can see why, if you sort of fill the gaps, this would have happened, but it is just very quick. And for that reason, you know, when the second half of the book is kind of focusing on that, it does mean that the conclusion feels a little bit contrived, like Forster just really wants a happy ending to occur, so makes it so. I think if he'd have just spent a bit more time fleshing that out, perhaps if Alec appeared earlier in the novel and there was an interaction between him and Maurice at some point, just to sort of sow the seeds for that relationship early on, even if it's just very subtle, even if it appears like a friendship or whatever, just so that then when it actually comes to fruition in the second part of the novel, it's a bit more believable. So that's my main criticism of the novel, is that ending, while I appreciate it and value it as metaphor, I think that in terms of the plot and the characters, it doesn't quite hang together as well as it should. And now for number 2, we have A Passage to India. A Passage to India is set during the time of the British Raj and during the Indian independence movement in the 1920s. The story focuses on 4 characters. We have Dr. Aziz, an Indian doctor, his British friend, the schoolmaster Cyril Fielding, a young woman called Adela Quested, who has arrived in India to secure her marriage to a young man called Ronnie, and Ronnie's mother, Mrs. Moore, who came travelling with Adela. The novel focuses on the different relationships between these characters, but the central thing that occurs is Adela and Mrs. Moore and Aziz go on a trip to the Malabar caves in India, and during this event, Adela is in one of the caves and she believes that she is assaulted by Dr. Aziz. This results in a scandalous court case, a clash between India and the British, and although Adela admits that actually she was wrong in the end, it is too late. All of those political and social tensions bubble to the surface, chaos ensues, and we spend time unpacking what this does to the relationships between the characters, especially focusing on the friendship between Dr. Aziz and Cyril Fielding. So this is arguably Forster's best known book outside of maybe a couple of others. It's also got a beautiful film, I think it was made in the 60s, that I would definitely recommend watching. One of the best film adaptations of a book I've ever seen, but that doesn't mean pass upon the novel, because the novel is also wonderful in and of itself. What I like about A Passage to India is that although it's a political novel, it doesn't fall into the traps of political novels. It doesn't focus too much on the political situation, such that the characters barely feel present, or every character just becomes a mouthpiece for a political ideology. Instead, the politics is the backdrop, and it exerts pressure on the characters, but Forster understands that there are personal relationships going on, and that's what he wants to explore. And while politics might touch on that, there are also other things that touch on that, such as people's anger, their greed, their pettiness, and obviously things like their culture too, but it's a much more personal novel rather than a political one. Taking us out of England for the first time in one of his books, we might worry that Forster isn't going to do very well just because he writes about England so beautifully, but he's able to carry his talent to India, and he captures India as well, just as well as England. And actually, one of my favourite passages, which I've talked about before in my reviews of this book, is one of the bits early on when we find ourselves at a mosque and Mrs. Moore goes there, and Aziz finds her there, and he's angry with her at first because he thinks she's not taken her shoes off. He learns that she has. They strike up this friendship and enjoy the night together. The scene in the Malabar caves as well is also mystical and eerie, so much so that it has lasting impacts on every character, not just Adela and Aziz. And we also have a moment towards the end as well where Aziz is out on a boat with, I think it's Mrs. Moore's other son, whose name escapes me right now, and again we have this beautiful moment as the boat is rocking along the river. All of these scenes are just absolutely magical in terms of the way that they are written. Some of Forster's best prose is in this book. I also think that Adela Quested is probably my favourite heroine of Forster's. Again, because she's got that idealistic thing that a lot of Forster heroines have, but she's put in a very novel environment, unlike the others. She goes to India, and I think she says something like, I want to see the real India. And she really learns that that's a bit of a silly thing to say, and she really, becomes a much more mature person through the course of the novel. In terms of character growth, I think that she is the most believable of Forster's female characters. She really goes through a great journey, and it's almost a shame that she sort of drops off towards the end of the novel as we focus more on Dr. Aziz and Cyril, but that's fine because their relationship is also fascinating, and something that Forster doesn't really focus on all that much in his novels is friendship. He has his sort of famous sisters in Howard's End. He has lots of brother-sister relationships, but a really good friendship is something that he doesn't touch upon that much. It tends to come secondary. But in this novel, we really get this friendship between Cyril and Aziz taking centre stage, and it's a fantastically done friendship. It's also quite a tragic book in the sense that although Forster doesn't focus too much on politics, he does recognise that cultural clashes do get in the way of interpersonal relationships, and Dr. Aziz and Cyril's friendship is definitely damaged in the long term by the events of the trial, and watching that all come down and sort of build towards a slightly hopeful ending is a perfect way to round off the story. And last on the list we have none other than Howard's End. Howard's End revolves around the lives of three families in England. We have the Wilcoxes, rich capitalists with fortunes made in the colonies. We have the half-German Schlegel siblings, Margaret, Helen and Tibby, who live with a moderately wealthy income, pursuing an intellectual life of socialism and trying to do good as best they can. And we have the much poorer Bast family, who go from several misfortunes throughout the novel. The socialist and idealistic Schlegel sisters do try to help the Basts, and they also try to get the Wilcoxes to break away from their capitalistic and greedy tendencies. But also, as they try to help the Basts, they realise that idealism isn't always a good pillow friend of reality. I really wasn't expecting to put Howard's End at the top of this list, because when I first read it, it was a similar experience to A Room with a View, where I could appreciate certain passages, I could appreciate what Forster was doing. There wasn't a completely unbelievable romance in this one. However, I just didn't gel with the story at all. It didn't move me in any significant way. However, this time around, this completely changed. The different families are all really well drawn, especially the Wilcoxes and the Schlegels, and the differences between the two. And I like the fact that, although it's quite clear that the Schlegels are the heroines in this story, the Wilcoxes are not portrayed as just these sort of stereotypical greedy capitalists, and sometimes they have a point. And we also see that the Schlegel sisters, especially Helen, can also ruin lives with their ideologies. There's a wonderful bit where Helen is trying to give Mr. Bast some money, and to do this she withdraws this money from her accounts, from some investments that she's made. And so you think, okay, that's a great thing, she's sacrificing some wealth to help someone. He then refuses several times, and then the sort of chapter ends with Forster pointing out that she puts the money back in and actually gets a huge gain on her investment. And Forster isn't criticising Helen here by saying, oh look, she's a terrible person, but it captures that idea that privilege gives you a lot of power, such that, the sacrifice that Helen made, in hindsight, wasn't all that much of a sacrifice because she actually benefited from it. Obviously, she didn't intend to do that, but it's just a nice point about social position in society and how when you reach a certain social position in society, regardless of your good intentions, you do have a safety net that you don't always appreciate, that someone like the Basts, they just don't have that at all. I think that's a beautiful part of the story. Another beautiful part of the story is when Forster makes these distinctions between country and city life. There's this passage about London at the beginning of a chapter that is just absolutely spot on. And again, it's something that is true of London even today. Forster, again, is a big proponent of nature, the natural world, and Howard's End really probably is the novel that drives that home, with Howard's End being this beautiful house in the countryside, and again we get some magical descriptions of that wonderful house. In fact, I finished reading this novel while I was on a trip to the Cotswolds the other weekend. The sun was shining, there were some people playing cricket nearby, it was about as English as you could get, and I was just reading this book, and I managed to devour the entire final maybe third or quarter of it in one sitting, because I was just so captured by the story and the environment. So if you live in the UK and you want to really get the most out of this book, I'd recommend picking a day like that, going to the country and just really absorbing the atmosphere as you read this wonderful book. Alright, that is it for my ranking of the works of E.M. Forster. If you've read these books, let me know your ranking down in the comments. If you've only read a few, let me know what you think of them. Let me know what you think of my ranking as well. I hope you enjoyed the video. Take care everyone. Ta-ra!